Okay, let's continue with the small intestine. So we talked a lot about those villi, those microvilli in the last presentation. I want to orient you. So we're still in the intestines, and I told you that the major function of the intestine, the small intestine, was to absorb nutrients into the body. So how exactly does that happen? Well, there are 4 ways that absorption of nutrients can happen. The first is passive diffusion, the second is facilitated diffusion, the third is active transport, and the fourth is phago and pinocytosis. I'm going to break each of these down. So the first, passive or simple diffusion. So this is when nutrients, so these are represented by these circular blobs here, pass through the cell membrane, that's this right here, from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So that's not shown in this picture from your textbook, but you can imagine if there's a lot of these, let's say they're little fat molecules on this side, and there are not many on this side, those molecules are going to passively, that means without energy, energy is not needed to have them pass through the membrane, they're going to pass through this membrane. So remember, in order to get the nutrients from the small intestine, so this would be the lumen, this open tube of the small intestines, and these would be those enterocytes. And in order to get them through those cells and then into either our lacteal or our capillaries, they've got to diffuse through a membrane. And so with this way, number one, with this way, passive diffusion, nutrients pass through from an area of higher concentration, so there's a lot out here, to an area of lower concentration. That does not take energy. So fats are actually absorbed this way in small droplets of water. Okay, the second is facilitated diffusion. And so again, this is still with nutrients passing from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So it's with the concentration gradient. But in this case, sometimes molecules are too big or too hydrophilic to pass through the cell membrane, and so they need a protein channel transport. So there are these protein channels in cell membranes that allow nutrients to pass through them. So you can imagine this is like a little canal, and there's a canoe, and it's going from here to here. So this does not take energy. It does not need ATP, but these molecules maybe are a little bit bigger or hydrophilic and don't pass through the membrane by themselves. They need a protein channel. So fructose is an example of a nutrient that is absorbed this way through the membrane. All right, the third type is active absorption. So active absorption requires energy, and so I put a little ATP molecule here to show this. So this is when a carrier or a transport protein and energy are needed for the nutrient to pass through the membrane. So in the last slide, we saw there was just a carrier protein or a transport protein that was needed, and here we need one of those membrane proteins as well as energy to help pump this nutrient through, and this usually happens against a concentration gradient. So there might be very little of these molecules here and a lot over here, and so they want to go this way, but the protein is pumping them this way. And this, an example of a nutrient that passes through the membrane this way is some sugars and some amino acids, so these building blocks of proteins. I like this slide here because it compares and contrasts passive diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and active absorption. So here you can see these molecules just pass right through this membrane. Here with facilitated diffusion, you can see this membrane protein, this transport protein, and it opens up this little channel for the molecules to pass through. This is facilitated diffusion. And then here we can see with active absorption, these green molecules are going against their concentration gradient. For these two examples, passive diffusion and facilitated diffusion, the molecules are moving with their concentration gradient. So from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. With active absorption, we see molecules move from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration. And so that's against the gradient, and so we need energy for that to help that carrier protein. So here is our fourth way that nutrients can be absorbed through the intestinal wall, and we lump these into one category. This is phagocytosis and pinocytosis. And so this is when the cell membrane, so here you can see this is the cell membrane, it actually folds in on itself and engulfs these particles, either solid particles, and if it's solid compounds, we call it phagocytosis. If it's liquids, we call it pinocytosis. And so there's this little indentation, and the cell membrane engulfs these particles, and then just basically break off from the cell membrane. And then they are absorbed. And one example of a compound that moves into the intestinal wall this way, past the membrane this way, is immune substances from breast milk are absorbed this way. This is a nice little summary slide in your book. This is figure 315 that shows all four of these methods of absorption through the intestinal wall. So here you can see the intestine, and this is the membrane. And so it's comparing each of these four methods of transport through the intestinal wall. Okay, so we talked about the small intestines. Let's move into the large intestines. So most of the absorption takes place in the small intestine, and now we're moving from the ileum of the small intestine into the large intestine. As you might have guessed, there is a sphincter. So food has to pass from the ileum of the small intestine into the large intestine through the ileocecal sphincter. So the sphincter is nice because its name tells you exactly where it is. It exists between the ileum, which is the end of the small intestine, and the cecum, which is the beginning of the large intestine. So the large intestine is composed of the cecum, and then here's the sphincter right here, the ileocecal sphincter, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and then the descending colon, because it's got this shape where it goes up, it goes across our body, and then it goes down, and then the sigmoid colon, and then the anal canal. So this is a picture of that ileocecal sphincter that food has to pass through. Any food that is not undigested from the small intestine has to pass through the sphincter to get into the large intestine. And then, so you can actually get these pictures off the internet from people who have had colonoscopies. A colonoscopy is when a probe is basically fished up through your large intestine to check for any polyps or cancers, because colon cancer is very serious, and it is a type of cancer that kills many people every year, and so having a colonoscopy can catch it in its early stages. Okay, so here are the parts of the large intestine. Here you can see the appendix coming off here. If your appendix gets infected, it can really hurt. It can burst. I actually had mine burst when I was 12. And had it surgically removed very soon after it burst. I don't remember a whole lot. It was very painful. I was in the hospital for a couple weeks because back then things were a little different, and they had to pump me with all these fluids to get the poisons out of my system. It wasn't very fun. So that's what happens when your appendix gets infected. It can burst. So the large intestine, what's the function of the large intestine? So this prepares waste for excretion from the body. Some absorption does happen in the large intestine. The vast majority of absorption happens in the small intestine, like we talked about, but the large intestine absorbs large amounts of water and some vitamins and fatty acids. when you eat something that doesn't agree with you or you get food poisoning, your body is trying to evacuate that food that contains the bacteria or whatever it is that is upsetting your GI tract. And if it's food poisoning, your body's going to evacuate that very quickly. It wants it out. And so your large intestine is not going to have time to absorb all that water, and that's why you get diarrhea. So one of the main functions of the large intestine is to absorb any water or most of the water that's left over that comes from the food that we eat and the drinks that we drink. Okay, so we moved into the rectum. We are going to talk a little bit more about the large intestines in terms of the gut microbiota that live there. So these are really, really important to us, and so I'm going to talk about them in a separate section. So let's talk about the rectum here. So here is the end of the large intestine, and you can see there are lots of strong muscles. Again, we have more sphincters. We have two actually that surround the rectum. And these muscles store waste matter in the body, our feces, until it can be voluntarily eliminated. So we talked about involuntary actions and voluntary actions. We don't really control how food moves through our body. Obviously, we can control how and when we eliminate our waste. And so our waste is eliminated when we relax these outer and inner sphincters. So what remains of our food when it gets to this point is a lot of undigested carbohydrates. We talked about fiber and how fiber cannot be digested. It passes through us. Connective tissue from meat that we eat, bacteria, body waste like dead cells that we need to get rid of, and just a little bit of water.